Okay.
Go back to it. Well, I just want to you do. I don't mind it. And you're gonna put that out.
I have this.
Whatever.
This guy's like a microphone.
Either that or I just wanted to make sure. It's usually a piece of too much stuff when you got here, but I want to make sure that
And she's got these. Pardon?
So much.
I mean, that was on there too. The threshold
Okay.
is what I sent her.
Okay. And is this different?
It should be this one. I don't know where this one came from.
This is the one you.
Because mine had the total down here.
This is the one you gave me at that other. No. Oh, I've already got too many.
This is the one I sent, which is, this was probably 206.
This
the
is the
latest
2006 one, and
The
I hung on to
2009, I just made sure we went, let's see, that was rotten.
this. Right. And
It's
I
the
don't know-
same.
Is it the same?
Pretty much the same, it just looks a little better like this, what I
Okay.
sent her.
Fine.
So we probably
So
don't
you're
need this
still
one.
using this one? That's from 2006.
We haven't used it since we were pretty much in rubber stamping stuff.
I knew that.
This is what we need to be using.
Okay. Well, so this is
This one
the-
I would probably just put to the side because we have, this is what it is.
all right.
It just
And they're
looks better.
exactly the same.
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah. Well, it might be give us.
See, I don't think they. Well, of course, I didn't have. No, it's not. It's not. No.
So, yeah, I sent her this one because mine total.
I'm sure this one does too.
Maybe it does. Okay, well, we can do
This
this.
is just a little more. Well, it's.
It's more.
This has more.
Yeah.
Gives you more of a scale.
Right.
And
We
you,
can
I
use this
just
one,
really
that's fine.
struck me how much that you said you really liked it, and I wanted to get it
Right.
introduced.
I think we just shortened it here, but if we want to like this one, it's fine.
Well, you know what I'm gonna do? Is, Jenny, can you just mark these all 2006 up in the corner, and then people will be able to tell the difference, including Rochelle. Just in the upper corner, just mark it 2006.
Because I think this one actually came off the 9. This one actually came off the 2009 application,
Yeah, I don't care.
so we can use that one.
Now, and you said you already brought these.
I brought the.
Okay. Jenny, I'm gonna give you these upside down because Rochelle brought them.
Issue tomorrow on 17th.
And they're just waiting for a signal from you, Karen. It's muted, but it's live.
We're live.
Yes.
I'm not gonna make any. Okay. All right. These are all ones that Rochelle sent you.
Yes.
Okay. Rochelle was late last time. We're hoping that she'd be here on time, but I'm not gonna wait very long to get started. Now, you want all these, right? You sent this to Jenny as well? All right. And was this something you sent to her?
That's what's in the contribution to agencies application, which is different than my application. That was for That's why you're probably seeing two different applications.
This is what Tina says is the application.
That's not part of my stuff.
Well, I just want people to have that, and then you had a handout regarding aging and right. And not the handouts, but there was one on aging and alcohol and drug that just sort of shows protocols now.
transportation committee.
Get it, that's it. That's the one.
It's probably negative.
Just tore it. Okay. All right, let's transfer. And is this is the total information we have about grant protocols for? Okay. Oh, here's Michelle. I do. Yep. Yep. Glad you're here.
Told you I would try to work something out.
I appreciate it so much.
Or mega binders.
Jenny. Jenny, I just pushed this,
I just do things when I hold.
push the red button.
The red to record, the square to stop.
Okay. Ready? Welcome, everyone. Today is, let's see, December the 9th. It's 3 p.m. This is a meeting of the Topeka City Council's Economic and Community Development Committee. Brief roll call.
Michelle de la Isla.
Nathan Schmidt.
And I'm Karen Hiller, Chair. Welcome, all of you. Our agenda today is to talk about, it's the second in a series of what we think may be 5 meetings to focus on social service grants and how the City of Topeka City Council handles that process and makes its priorities and choices. Oops. I'm slow, Jenny, but okay, good. The focus of the meeting today is on performance criteria and monitoring. And you saw us shuffling papers as there seemed to be a variety of formats over time and even in 2013 for the 2014 grants that were used. And part of our challenge is to see if we can sort that out, figure out what we've been doing, what we want to do, what's of course most important for people in the community. We will be talking about process for the applications next time. So truthfully, as much as we can, obviously process can have something to do with it, but we're going to focus on performance criteria and monitoring today. As with the last meeting, it's my top priority as the chair to make sure that the committee members have plenty of time to talk to one another and to learn and explore these issues. So that will be our top priority of the meeting. We will therefore conduct it in a work session format as far as council's concerned. It will be our agenda. If we want to, nonetheless, if people feel like we need some clarification or correction, feel free to let us know and we will include you in that conversation. If there is time available at the end, we will take public comment. This meeting has to adjourn at 5 o'clock because of the building shuts down at 5. So we may go a few minutes over, but not much. So we are time limited in that way. Let me see. I want to thank staff, just so the committee knows, the staff that works on the grants called me after our last meeting and asked to visit a little bit about process. Just want to thank Rochelle for that. It really was helpful to me and I think will make this meeting a little bit better. We have a variety of updated reports on the county has made their social service allocations, the city has made alcohol and drug since the last time that we met, just to relieve and clutter and help with focus on this meeting. We've got those to hand out at the end of the meeting. So don't go without them. Without much further ado then, I would like to introduce Rochelle Vega-Ritana. She is staff for the CDBG grants and has consulted with the staff for our general fund grants. And she's going to start off with a presentation and some handouts about how that process has gone in 2014. And fortunately for us, she has some years of experience working with these grants, and so she's got some history as well. Rochelle?
Okay, well, I was giving, the first thing was an Exhibit B. It talks about focus area goals and indicators. And I believe that's what was sent out with the contribution to agencies, which I don't work with those. I believe Celeste was working with those agencies. But that Exhibit B is the same thing that is on my,
Rochelle, we've got lots of handouts. People had a few in front of them when they sat down. But all that was absolutely at our places when we started was the 2014 Youth and Social Services application
that's the
and an
RFP.
agenda. This
That's the RFP, that's not exactly the application.
This is the request for proposal. I just
Right.
want to make sure everybody's looking at what you need us to see. So, do we have a document that, because I've left them with you in a clip so that you could,
The application, I didn't include the application,
correct,
because that was next
But you-
time. But I was going to say,
okay.
Exhibit B on the contribution to agencies is the same as my page 9 of the application. And it would be this one, which I emailed Jenny.
Do we have those, Jenny, in a clip? I gave Rochelle some of the things that we had in a clip.
Here we go.
Okay. Thank you.
So those are, that is the same thing that was page 9 of my applications. And it, it asks about, describe all your program indicators and goals that your program intends to accomplish. Explain how each of these will be measured. So you were asking about that.
Mm-hmm.
What we look at during the application. Now, we had used, I have this threshold eligibility criteria and guide to scoring, which we used to use these, I think the last time we used it might have been 2009, but we kind of quit using it, as we were just getting, we'll just give them what we did last year, So we quit using because it was kind of a waste of people's time. The agencies would go through all this, and then we would score them, and then for the, the council would just say, just give them what they got last year, we'll just go, direct cut across the board.
Do you have can you give us the handout for the scoring then?
Sure, here's the scoring handout. And there's a threshold criteria that I would look at when the application actually came in. So this was kind of mine, and then when we would have a review committee that would actually look at all the applications, and then they would use that scoring tool to score all the applications, and then that recommendation of the scoring would go to city council. Okay, so that's what that was about. In the last few years, we haven't been using that.
Haven't used it at all.
No.
Okay.
Councilwoman,
Yes,
may I?
please.
Thank you. So, we had a system in which the grants would come already pre-sorted as approval and the highest ranking grants prior to coming to council. Was this
Right.
document delivered to council?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure they had that document, and each of there was a spreadsheet that had the agency's name, program, and then their total score. And that was the recommendation from the review committee that we would give to city council.
I have a follow-up question.
Go right ahead.
Was city council ever educated with regards to why this criteria was put in place and therefore able to, you know, make their votes based on this, on the work that staff had already done?
Now that I'm not sure, cause I kinda came in, there was some change in staff at H&D, and Jim Olson from CRC, he was also in leading this with the review committee. And, probably, I believe, there was a background here that, Jim Olson had written up, and it talked about the criteria, the city's priorities, how they should be relooked at, and all of that was given to council back in 2006.
Who wrote this document?
Jim Olson, he was the director of CRC at the time. He was very involved with, social services, special alcohol and drug, with all of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Councilwoman.
You're welcome. Proceed, Rochelle. Do you have more?
Well, I just wanted to say that, on my side, I call them my agencies, they're required to give, quarterly reports on the demographics, and on their goals and indicators on a quarterly basis. My programs are on a reimbursement basis, so before they get their, reimbursement, I have to have those reports, and there's sometimes I hold off on actually giving the allocation or the reimbursement until I receive those reports. And so those reports, Brad always asks me for my numbers quarterly, so I believe he turns in those numbers to city council also. It'll basically probably just say the numbers that they've actually served, but I don't believe it's going to show you their, what were their outcomes, what were, how did they get to that? But I have that information in the files. And then you had also asked me, Karen, for, at one time, back in the day, we did use the logic model.
Mm-hmm.
And I have copies of those also. But that was pulled out, so we condensed the application, where we took out the logic models.
And roughly when did that get pulled out?
I think the last time we used it was 2009. I went back to find the latest application that used them with, so it was 2009.
And help me with, I don't wanna put words in your mouth. You mentioned a little earlier that some of this began to change when the council was simply not looking at all of that.
Well, I think, the budget, there was a lot of back and forth with, the county about who was gonna fund the elderly and who wasn't gonna fund. And then, so basically, we'll just across the board cut, or we're just gonna give them what they received last year. So the recommendations that the grant committee was actually giving were really not being looked at. So that, a lot of the review committee members they didn't want to be on the review committee because it was just a waste of their time. The agencies kind of thought, why go through all this when it's a waste, when they're just giving us across the board cut. So at that time, Randy Speaker was our director, so we just modified the grant, basically, what I needed to do the contracts and for reporting to HUD is what we had to include in the grant application.
Go ahead.
In the recommendation process, was there ever, because by what I'm looking at here, there is no scoring criteria that pertain to prior year performance.
Well,
Was that also evaluated as part of the process?
Well, right here, this was the only thing that I would score as myself, knowing the grants, knowing if they got the reporting on time, whether the documentation was there, whether I had to keep, asking them for stuff. So this would have been, I would think, what you were asking. So that was the only one that I would totally score on because the review committee members didn't know the grant performance of the agency, but I did. So that's where we would score at. And then we also would do interviews. I didn't put that in. There were-
Can you, we can't see what you're pointing to on that form. When you talk about, are you using the
It's on the second
guide
page.
to scoring? You were talking about where? So the only place that was scored on whether people were accomplishing their outcomes was this 5 points on whether their grant administration was effective.
Well, they could tell in the application too, what they had, said their outcomes and goals would be, whether they met that criteria, cause they would always ask for previous goals. And then, so they would list, I think, 2 years back. But that question was more for, I thought was more for grant performance, whether you got the reports on time, whether they had to ask for extensions on their money.
Okay.
And I said we also would do, interviews with each of the agencies. They would come in, I think they had a 10-minute presentation, where they would give a presentation on their program, and then there would be, questions and answers at the end, in case the review committee had questions, but they were given the applications ahead of time along with the scoring, so they would actually score it before they did the presentation, but then, once they heard the presentation, they could change their scoring if they thought it was needed. So they had a basis on what they thought that the program would score, but then, like I said, once in a while, when they did the presentation, their scoring would change a lot, because they were able to fill out questions that they had for the agency.
Okay. I actually, in looking at this guide to scoring, because we did want to talk about, we'll talk further about process, but just the performance and the priorities and so on. Okay, the project consistent with the goals of the grants, that presumes that somebody set some priorities
On the
on what was
RFP,
going to be funded.
right, on the RFP, it lists the city's goals and the CDBGs, we have to follow.
Okay,
So it listed those in the RFP.
and obviously, that would be important, so we're not just
Right.
renewing. Okay, activities and services are sound. Arguably, that 5 points would be performance and, the choice of activities related anyway. Outcomes clear and related to needs, another 5 points. Measurable impact, 10 points. But you're right, Councilwoman De La Isla, it doesn't go back to actual performance.
Mhm. And not only,
Capacity, budget, mechanism for client input, but no look at whether they took it, used it.
and not
Got
only
it.
that, but it's only 5 points out of 100 points total, which
Mhm.
seems, so if somebody were, and I'm not saying that any agency has done such a thing, but if somebody were to go ahead and utilize grant funds from the city, and then you did not use the funds according to the criteria, you only have 5 points minus in order for you to be able to reapply for the grant, which
Mhm.
is very questionable.
Rochelle, anything else to bring to the table? This is great.
No, I think pretty much my agencies are familiar with it. Most of them are the same agency that had got funded back in 2006, so they're a little relieved we didn't use a logic model, but I believe we should probably go back to with the way funding is changing, the way the grants are being looked at it through all agencies, not just the city, but United Way, all the other funders.
Mm-hmm.
And the priorities for sure need to be reviewed. We were, I think, asking, you know, that back then.
Mm-hmm.
My agencies are used to reporting quarterly, you know, I don't know, I mean, you know, by HUD we're required, and there's certain things that they have to report in, so. And I had our general fund agencies using the same reporting form, so they
But-
were already reporting.
But what you're saying also then is, and we sort of tasked ourselves to randomly picking at least 5 applications and looking at what people said before we came into this meeting. But what you're, if I hear you correctly, that we took, the logic model's been gone for a few years. People were simply self-choosing what they said they were going to do and what they were going to report on. You looked at whether they reported on what they promised, but no one was evaluating whether those goals were outcomes-based versus just activity-based,
Yeah.
or
pretty-
whether feedback had been continual feedback and quality improvement was happening. You just, whatever they picked to
Pretty much, yeah.
do, it was not, okay. I really appreciate your work on this and your bringing us current with what's been going on. This is very helpful. Does anybody have other questions? We can certainly ask Michelle other questions later. If,
I
excuse me?
just want to interject something here, is that this was also the time that the balanced scorecard was put into place. And Celeste worked with us, so we had to go into specific areas within the city that were the 4 or 5
Yeah.
basic priorities of the city. Each grant had to fit into one of those. And then I know Celeste called people and said that your widgets will be counted. So if you, I'm gonna use Heidi, if she says she's gonna feed 500 people and she only feeds 496, that will be counted. Am I correct? Where's Heidi? But that was Celeste, that I think was looking at some of those grants that way.
Well, I think she was looking more at the ones that hadn't been reporting at all,
Right.
which were the contribution to agencies, because that was all new to them, as, you know, as reporting.
And so that was put right into, I mean, I remember sitting in a meeting with many of the social service people saying, okay, where are we gonna put Meals on Wheels? Which of those is that? Is it gonna be safety? Is it gonna be infrastructure? You know, and so we had to put our widget into a widget, and then we had to turn around and give what it was gonna be judged on.
And just for a little, just to clarify with,
I've been asked to have them speak at the mic.
oh,
If that's-
Oh, I'm so sorry.
sorry, I'm sorry.
All right.
Yeah, we'll do that from, there's a mic over here, so if people are speaking from the back, that lets the camera catch the audio more clearly. Just a little background then, we have the youth and social services grants, some of which are funded with community development block grant money, which is administered by Housing and Neighborhood Development. Some were general fund and some was a mix. So when, Rochelle, you're talking about contributions to agencies,
There were-
that's the general fund grants.
Well, I also deal with general fund grants. I think
Okay.
those were, the contribution to agencies were more like a line item.
Okay,
Mine were competitive grants,
gotcha.
which included general fund, which all of CDBG, and some agencies get both general fund and CDBG.
Okay, so anything that was out of youth and social services, you were monitoring.
Right.
Okay,
Now, the contribution to agencies, that was Celeste and Pam, the last 2 that I know that worked on it.
okay.
And so that's probably why the applications were different, because they handled those contribution to agencies, sent them out, and I sent mine to
Okay.
my people.
And I don't know that we need to dwell a whole lot on the differences. What we know is they were handled differently and we want to pull this
Right.
together. Part of what we need to look at it sounds like, is the issue of priorities of the city, which we don't need to decide right now. It's just those priorities haven't been set out. They certainly haven't been set out by the council in a long time. But then in terms of performance and monitoring, which is our task today, the issue is, are we interested in looking at more of an outcomes-based process, or one that's strictly activities, which is different. Outputs are different than outcomes. Then also the monitoring of whether people are achieving that, both on a quarterly basis as well as on an annual basis anyway, for the council to have that feedback. And even though we're talking about priorities, the performance today in the back of our minds certainly is who can help us do that. So we really haven't had staff assigned at that level, except perhaps for the assistance of CRC. Shall we switch to what you all saw when you did your review of the applications? Did you each get a chance to go through a sampling of them? Nathan, what'd you see? Questions, observations?
Well, I saw a variety of things that in a non-uniform collection of, I guess, accounting and metrics. I had a difficult time. You guys were probably both better at this because you deal with this or have dealt with this for years. I had a difficult time discerning, I guess a central or uniform way of measuring these programs against each other. I think they all attempted, and were successful in a lot of ways in showing, their goals, how they met their goals, and what the impact of those goals was. What I found difficult between all of them was that everything was so different. I didn't find any uniformity in any of it, so it's hard to, when you're talking about competitive grant programs, it's hard to say, who deserves more money or who deserves a better grant when you've got such variation in outcomes or outputs, as you said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That was the general theme I got out of it.
Michelle?
I was second what Nathan said. I mean, like, for example, I could take two organizations that we're funding. One of the organizations is LULAC, which is talking about how they're going to provide transportation and the meals for the citizens and whatever. And then you have also, Project Health Access. And, you're providing healthcare. And when you're trying to make an evaluation on how these two programs, which are completely separate in two universes, on how they're serving our community, it really makes it difficult because, as you can see here on page 9, we have them being able to tell us what they're going to measure themselves against, rather than us as an entity establishing the parameters. The organizations then are in turn able to give us the parameters, which allows for what I was speaking about when I started the conversation at the budget time, the chance of somebody going ahead and trying to work into fitting into the model, because then you're able to determine what you're going to say that your outcomes are, rather than the city being pointed and saying, okay, we want to fund these efforts. How are you going to go ahead and bring about the support that the city is looking for in these areas that we have as priority?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's.
You're right that they're very different. We could tear apart sample after sample. Do you have some thoughts? And I know Rochelle just handed out the pieces from 2006. I was really glad to have a model that we could look at that perhaps with some tweaking we could go back to. And I know I've had a little bit of advanced time on that, but out of that review and the concerns that we've talked about before, for performance and monitoring, do you have some thoughts on on what we could do to make that system better?
I think that the first place that we start is by establishing what our priorities are going to be. Once we are able to establish what our priorities are going to be, then we're able to go ahead and determine what things are going to be measured based on those. But until we don't determine where our priorities are, it's gonna be very hard for us to establish a uniform system to monitor these grants.
I agree. I thought this scoring, which I hadn't seen before, has a lot of what I was, thinking about with my ideas. The idea of creating, the priorities, and then scoring how each project aligns with those priorities allows us to come up with, metrics based on, how much we're achieving towards those priorities per dollar spent, which is kind of how we want to make sure that we're doing this as efficiently and effectively as possible. But the key to that is establishing priorities and ranking applications based on how closely they match and how closely they meet those priorities. Then the impacts of those, we have, essentially a multiplier, based on their score with how they're eating or reaching their priorities. I think a scoring criteria like the one presented, with some modification, is a much improved way to go from where we're at right now.
Appreciate that, and then earlier, there was reaction to the discussion of the logic model. Do you think that we should go back to something like that? Again, it's new. Again, a logic model is outcomes-based rather than just activity-based. Why are we doing this? So what? What's gonna happen? Doesn't always mean you save the world by the end of the year. It's easier said than done. But,
I think that the whole purpose of establishing the priorities is then so that you would have pretty much the logic model laid out already. And that way, all we have to do is just measure what we have established as priority and how it's being impacted. And you and I know that as grant writers, when you're writing a grant and you have to come up with the logic model, a lot of people find themselves stumped because there is a huge problem with people trying to determine what the difference of an outcome versus an output and, all the processes and all the parts that go into writing one. I'm part of wanting to do this process is not for us to want to convolute it more.
right,
It's for us to try to simplify it, not only for the people writing the grants, but I think also for us as we're evaluating it.
go ahead.
I agree. That was, after going through these, and like I said, you guys are a lot more familiar with this than I am. The overwhelming feeling that I had was that we need to make this process simpler instead of just trying to create, more work for people who win these grants, to report and piling on more metrics and more work and everything for them. Let's make simpler ones that make sense and that are readable, because nobody reads them anyways otherwise, and then you end up with, council after council saying, well, we'll just fund everything the same way we did last year. That's the reason that those kinds of situations come about.
Something that's interesting, and of course I've been on the council through some of it, and Rochelle talked about some of it too, is that it sounds like priorities were inserted into this process periodically, even let's just say in the last 5 years. The balanced scorecard, and here's some priorities, so follow those, or the HUD priorities on the community development side. That council was never involved in setting those priorities, so I'm not sure the council knew. What I'm pulling out of that then is that whatever those priorities are, it sounds like we need a process whereby the council itself sets those priorities, perhaps in April or something like that every year, so it's very clear what they are to the council itself as well as to the, maybe May.
I was gonna say, April is a really bad time, because that's when people get elected. I think that it would be a good idea to do it earlier in the year, because you have people that have already been enough months within the council that they're able to provide some input. But once you do it after the month of April, you're going to encounter new council members coming in. Of course, there's a year in which we don't have transition, but you're
Right.
still gonna encounter people that are gonna come in and they're gonna go and they're gonna be slammed into the budget. Speaking from experience.
Right. So set them when, and I realize we're brainstorming at this point, but we wanna move this down with some ideas. When you said very early in the year, couple of months, when would you do it? Off the top of your head?
I would try to say January. City is done with their budget. We're starting a brand new year.
City manager, when is it, and I know you're trying to back up the budget process as well. Either when are you now or when are you hoping to set the master administrative priorities and ask the departments to begin submitting budget information to you?
January. I
Okay.
think Councilmember DeLisla's comments are absolutely right on, where it is so easy to convolute this, to use the term that was used. We really want to just make sure that we're giving everybody an opportunity to compete for the grants without jumping through our particular hoops. So if you identify 3 or 4 priorities, whatever it is, then they can come in and say, this is how we're gonna meet that priority, and then the measurement process allows us to, at the end of it, to come back and say, you said you're gonna do this, did you do this? And if they did it, fine, and if it worked for us, fine, then we go forward, possibly assuming the funding's available. If they didn't, we have to understand why. What happened within their particular model, where there's some external events that occurred, or did they just, were they not capable, of doing that, and then that helps make that funding decision. But I commend you for what you're doing. I would just caution not to make this too difficult. But let me answer the question, January.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for the extra as well. Well, we can look at that logic model and see, but I mean, the issue is, why are we funding it all? And we run into it, all of us personally, as well as elected officials, of people whose, I think to the person, people's hearts are large, and they just say, well, if I can just help one person, it's worth it. We've all done that, we've been there. Yet, as stewards of those public dollars, deciding what kind of accomplishment, teach a man to fish and he'll fish for a lifetime, feed a man to fish and he'll eat for a day. Both of those are important. Do you have some thoughts further about how we might, what kinds of priorities we might set, or how we would frame that priority setting?
Well, I have further thoughts on what the city manager just said.
Okay.
With regard to setting priorities and then using those to determine both whether they were able to achieve those priorities, to what degree. And I think another element that is important in that, and an element that hasn't been all that present in these in this grant funding thus far, is that it allows us to be competitive, because we may have a group that meets a said priority at a certain level, and we may have new groups that are applying for funding that think that they can meet those levels at a greater, and it provides us with a clear scoring metric to differentiate between competing groups. And I think that's something that we all want, is we want as many people as possible involved in trying to meet the priorities that we have. So I think somebody may disagree with me on that.
Good.
It's not so much disagreement. I agree with what you're saying, but I think that what everybody is dancing around is the fact that nobody wants to sit down right now and say, these are our priorities. And that's the tough part that we're at.
Mm-hmm.
We're in the place in which, as a body, we are to determine what are going to be the priorities, and we are not able to do that, number one, unless we are in communication with our city manager, because I'm sure that there is a plan for the future for our city, and we want to make sure that these funds also in some sort of way, shape, or fashion align with those desires. Of course, there are things that in the community are understood as needs that maybe as this group we should be looking at, that of course are not coming directly from the social service agencies, because every single one of the social service agencies are serving and fitting a huge need within our community. But then what other places do we have as resources that we can tap into that are outlining where our community is needing the most, so that then we can partner in that way to take a look at what the community is needing, and then us make a determination based on that.
Let me remind you that we did go through the subject areas last time. And at that point, the feedback from this committee was that all of them seemed important.
At that point.
So,
At that point.
And we can, rather than reinvent that today, can certainly pull that list out as we get close to wrapping up our work here and say yes, no, is there something we need to add to that list, or some of these program areas that would go off. But the other part of the priorities and the performance is what are we measuring? We had a youth services, the whole issue of youth services, aging services. There've been lots of discussions. The council hasn't been involved in those discussions. The United Way has, some other funding venues have. I mean, we became briefed about the fact that the whole issue of I'm just using this as a kind of a random example, the transportation and efficiencies, and who needed the transportation, where it was needed, where it was just something to do for aging services. We as a council didn't spend any time reviewing those priorities.
The mayor has been involved in those. He has attended many of those meetings.
But the council has not.
No, but,
Yep.
but the mayor has.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a matter of how much of that is shared and how much we're briefed on. That's driven through a logic model in terms of the value. Those discussions. City Manager.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I just want to, I'm a process person, and so I always tend to cut through things, and I just want to make sure that we really focus on the fact that the reason that we're sitting here today, or that you're sitting here today, and I'm sitting with you, is that during the budget process, I think there was a recognition that there was a lot of opportunity for us to do this better. And you were identified as that group of people to come back to council. So I think to get wrapped up on the fact that what was known and what was not known isn't necessarily beneficial, but the fact is that you were really tasked with and accepted that task, in fact, pushed for that task, to identify what the priorities were, to identify what was the way in which we were going to take application to ensure that there was the greatest opportunity for people to not get boxed out because they weren't in before. And thirdly, to make sure that we identified whether somebody truly performed or didn't perform. So I want to make sure that we really looked at, there's a clean slate today that you've been challenged with to bring back to council to answer those very questions, which I think is causing you some concern in your statement. So the power to fix it is right here at this table.
Okay. Do you have, one of the things I'm seeing is the issue of staffing, of advising the council on, both in terms of the review team as well as just helping us set the priorities and make sure that the communication is occurring with the other funding sources. Ginny gathered for me, we have the United Way process here, we have the aging process, we have the alcohol and drug process. The council's been sort of doing its thing in a silo, and as Rochelle said, for the last few years, just 10% up, 10% down, something like that, to really be connected with what these other entities are doing to set those priorities, to figure out if we're gonna sort, well, let's say, which has been discussed on and off for years, that the county does all the aging and they just focus on that and the city does other things. Where should we be looking for staff to help do that? It's tough for the council to wrap themselves around it all by themselves.
Well, we're certainly available to do that, and the idea that was outlined during the budget session was for council to meet in this committee and do that. We are available to run down any of the data that you want. So the answer is whatever we need. We have the HND staff, we have the planning staff. Certainly my office and several others are available to run down the information as to who else is doing what, to arrange meetings with other organizations such as the counties, CRC, anybody else to do that. We're really just seeking direction at this point. So once again, as I envisioned this, I didn't see this as a tremendously extensive series of meetings. I really saw it as get together, identify what are your priorities that you want to bring back to council. From that, I could see council maybe asking some questions. Well, if we don't do that, who will do that? We can provide that information, but we need to find out where you're at on that. The second thing is what is the best way to intake this information? We've identified some information, maybe we've identified too much, and it gets convoluted. So we're here to do whatever, but we're really looking for direction. I mean, last time you all met, you went through everything that we did last year, and at the end of it, well, we like it all. At some point, you have to make tough decisions.
Right.
Are we going to be committed to youth? Are we going to be committed to aging? Are we going to be committed to feeding hungry people? Whatever it is. And I think that's a determination that needs to be led by the city council. But we're always willing to tell you what the statistics are and what the challenges are, though I know all three of you are very well aware of what the challenges are in this community.
And thank you. I said that for two reasons. One, I mean, immediately, CRC has performed that function in the past. The city council has really not relied on anybody to get that kind of feedback in the last few years. And so moving forward each year as we went through the priorities and doing more than, Rochelle has done a wonderful job, but it's been more, in her assignment, it's been much more clerical. Just take them in, get the scoring done, get the reports. If we wanted a higher if we wanted somebody that could do more than that for us on a regular basis, we need to decide how we get that. I mean, if all we do is look at what we've done in the past or who wants to apply for funding from us, we'll get a lot, but there are all these other systems in progress. United Way is doing priority setting and grant making and setting standards, as are these other sources, is my point. And it takes a fair amount of time to be able to loop that up and make sure that we're operating in conjunction with all of those other pieces too. Yes?
Madam Chair, would
Yes.
it be adequate then for us to then establish a meeting with the major funders in the city of Topeka that are looking at the city as a whole and then have this discussion with them?
Specifically, we could, or at least know, and Ginny has brought us reports already and she's got some updates now that the county made their social services funding and the alcohol and drug grants have been made, to at least have the reports of who's doing other pieces. As we look at what the priorities are, maybe alcohol and drug is a big priority to us, let's say, but it's already being covered by another source. So we might choose that we don't need to fund alcohol and drug programs through this source. That's my point. There's context there.
And that's why I think that it would save a lot of time if we have all the crucial players on the table and just have an open meeting in which we could have an open discussion to ask these sorts of questions that
Okay.
you may have, rather than having staff involved in pulling all these documents for us to, that would be labor and you would lose the essence. It's almost like what Rochelle was saying, that you had a scoring system, but then it was not until you sat down with the agencies that you were able to fully have a full grasp of what you were really looking for. The same thing would happen with us, with the county, for example, as having a representative from the county that would be able to speak for them, having a representative from United Way, maybe having a representative from the CRC that works with all the other organizations, so that we could then all sit together and talk about what are the funding priorities, why, and where does the city fit into all of this.
Can do that. Well, let me get back. I don't want it to be for performance criteria and monitoring, if without the specifics, we've really come to some consensus already. What we want is priorities in advance. Is that what I'm hearing? We want performance criteria that this first view on this guide to scoring, but the scoring process looks good. We just want it to be much more specific about performance, not just proposals, and be weighted. We want to make sure that we are evaluating actual performance.
I
In
would
the
say
future?
yes. I would say that here in the back, where it talks about grant administration being effective, outlining maybe some markers that will let us know were the goals established in the prior year grant, accomplished? Were the reports on time? Just the pertinent questions, and then rather than being 5 points, I would say that this would be a much bigger portion.
How do you want it? It sounds like this, at least this concept is appealing to be able to evaluate on performance. Do you want to ask staff to kind of review this and perhaps recalibrate it or put new language in for us? Do you want to look at it?
I think that it would be hard for us to ask staff to go ahead and reevaluate this without them knowing what the priorities are and what we're looking for. And I think that as we determine what those priorities are, we have a wonderful document here in front of us that has a lot of what we're looking for. That once we know where we want to focus our strengths are, we can sit down here in a meeting and spend an hour hashing out how these priorities fit into what we want to accomplish.
I'll challenge you a little bit, because this is a pretty generic score sheet that says you will do some ranking based on the priorities, but it doesn't matter what the priorities are in terms of checking whether somebody's met the priorities, in terms of whether their activities are performance-based, whether their reporting is occurring. This is pretty generic and can be done regardless of what we need to do that too, but in terms of performance-based and monitoring, if we want to do more than we were, we can start to work on that. Nathan?
I agree with that, and this is something that I was thinking about over the weekend, with how to set this up based on the priorities and how we're going to score that. I think what we did last time is we came up with a bunch of categories, not necessarily priorities.
Correct.
And I think the simplest way that you attack that issue is we have, for example, if aging services is one of our categories, we set the top 3 priorities in that service, whether that be meals to the elderly or transportation, and you weight those based on what we decide are the top priorities. And so that you have 10 points possible if let's say that transportation is the number 1 issue that we feel needs to be dealt with in that category. If your program meets transportation needs, you can get a maximum of 10 points. If food is the number 2 priority, and meals, then your maximum point total is 8 points, and so forth. And you tier it that way so that we have definitive. We can set the priorities based on how we're scoring this, and so that the priorities actually mean something, and I think that allows us to be more specific. If we go with categories and allow people to decide which categories they want to participate in and which direct impacts they want to target within those categories. And then you can take these less clear, these more generic criteria and assign definitive number values to them that allow us to present an objective scoring criteria. If that makes, I don't know if does that make any sense?
I wasn't following it exactly. I mean, we set our categories kind of over here, and then our priorities. And the priorities could be by category, or they could be that we want to do long-term outcomes based. We want to do we want to make sure we have rides and we have food, or however we wanna prioritize the grants, then this would say, did you meet the priorities? Where do you rank in those priorities? And you get the points, right? We,
No, not really. I mean, kind of, but yes, we'll do categories, you know, like aging.
mhm.
And then if we determine that the biggest need in the aging population is transportation, and then second is nutrition.
Mhm.
This first, category here, that project is consistent with stated goals,
Mhm.
you could have it the same way here,
Mhm.
but you value it based on the priorities that we set. So if you're going after what we think is the top priority in that category, you can achieve 10 points on this
Right.
part. And then
Right.
8 points and so forth
Mhm.
down. But it has to be, I mean, it is specific to those priorities within each category that we designate, that you have to meet those priorities to get any points in the scoring system.
I think we're good.
Okay?
You just don't want a separate scoring sheet for each topic. You want a generic rating sheet.
Generic in the rating, but specific into how, so, I mean, you can do the same thing and multiply, 10, 7, 3, score it the same way
Mhm.
for transportation as you do for nutrition. But, if it's, and then multiply it by 10. So it's by 10 if it deals with transportation, it's by 8 if it deals with, or you can change the numbers either way, it's the same thing. You're giving preferential treatment in a definitive way to the listed priorities.
City manager, you talked about the fact that we would have access to statistical numbers with regards to needs within our city. Is that something that we have available somewhere?
If it's not available, we'll make it available, and in the manner in which you talked about. Let's talk to CRC, let's talk to the service providers, let's talk to people who are doing this, who are the content experts here. I think we need to find out where are the number one priorities of interest that we have in our social network.
Mhm.
And number two, what are the biggest gaps that we can make a difference in? If we can identify those things,
100%
then
agree.
we've got a winner.
100% agree.
And to the degree that we can measure the ability of service providers to deliver in those areas, then we're getting further down the road. And then at the end of the year, we go back and say, let's remind you, this is what you said you were gonna do. Did you do it? And if you did it, we're good going forward. If not, you have to help me understand why.
And the reason that I'm asking this is because as we started talking about creating a procedure for evaluation, we keep coming back to what are the priorities that we're gonna rank these in, which is what you're trying to say, Nathan. You're trying to say, okay, yes, I think this document is pretty good, but it needs more beef with regards to the priorities. And the higher they meet our priority, the higher we're going to score them, which I absolutely agree with, but we don't have priorities.
Correct. We have categories.
Exactly, we have categories
Mhm.
that we agreed when we started the process that we wanted to go ahead and release the funding for all of the organizations, but we did say at the end of this meeting, there are changes that are going to come. We are gonna have to look at the priorities, we're gonna have to look at the city's needs, and then from there, we're gonna go ahead and make some changes.
Madam Chair,
Please.
if I could make a recommendation, staff would be pleased to pick up those challenges and then maybe come back to you with a recommendation in advance of and to be discussed at the next meeting, so that you're being prepared, if that would be helpful in achieving your objectives.
I think it would. It sounds like it, both from our work from last week where we identified categories, help me if I'm wrong, to do, there are volumes of background on that. I guess I'm thinking the categories, and are they funded by other sources? And are there some categories that we missed that are out there that could be considered? we still would need to prioritize them, but we're just, the field would be all the categories, and are there other sources that are funding them? And I do think with the discussion that we've had so far, that if staff could have a look at that, with the discussion that you've both heard so far, could look at the scoring criteria and have a look at how we might be able to do better with that. Something like that based on what you've heard in terms of categories and priorities and performance.
We'd be pleased to do so.
Anything else? It did help me back up a little bit in terms of the needs. We did ask people to identify needs in those applications. And you reviewed the ones that you did. Were there concerns about that? What they were telling us?
We have, I mean, as a community, because of just the vast amount of organizations that we have present here, there's different needs. And I think that, again, I go back to the fact that when we go back and look at our challenge as a city and what we were tasked with, I don't have any concern with the needs that are being presented here. I feel that every single organization that is here is putting their heart and soul into doing their mission. And as a service to them, we have to determine what our priorities are, so that then if it were to occur that they do not fall under the city's priority anymore, they are able to go ahead and seek funding sources that do, they meet the criteria of. And then for those that do fall under our priority, so that then we can go ahead and fund them adequately, so that they are able to be successful in fulfilling the mission. Do I have any concerns with any of their missions? Absolutely not. With any of the needs? Absolutely not. Every single need that is represented here is a worthy cause.
I'm gonna push you all a little bit more on performance itself. That's not the priorities. That's not the application process. Concerns about whether there is performance and whether we're looking at what we need to look at upfront and as we monitor.
I think that right now, as I looked at all the applications and looked at what they're providing, organizations are providing the best that they can provide in a time in which they're being pressed and crunched by budget. We are in the middle of one of the worst economic recessions that our history has seen. Therefore, all of these nonprofits are facing staff cuts. They are facing constraints. They have to reinvent themselves. And I think that what they have been able to produce is what they have been able to produce. So I have no concerns with regards. I remember that when I used to work at Housing and Credit Counseling, one of the concerns that we always had was, are we providing these services? And then are we providing these services? Do we have to write that we're gonna do more service in order for us to get more money? And the answer was, organizationally, it was impossible. So therefore, you were writing a grant that was unrealistic for the outcomes that you said that you were going to perform. So is there any concern with regards to the performance of any of these agencies? I would say no, none at all.
I would ask the city manager third then to have staff nonetheless look at the logic model versus simply activity reports in terms of guidance for the council to be able to set up performance-based applications and monitoring. That's tough to do, but some guidance to us as to whether, obviously we've gone back and forth as far as whether that's in there.
Okay.
Monitoring, quarterly monitoring appears to be adequate once we get the priorities and the performance criteria.
I think so.
And it doesn't, I'm not hearing any concern in terms of that monitoring. Then also sounds like the system of you've got to have all your reports in before we'll release your money, and paying people based on performance achieved is working. Not hearing any suggestions on changes for that.
The only suggestion I would change on that is Michelle's suggestion earlier that should probably be a larger portion of the scoring, but other than that, I mean, I like the way it's scored, just add a few more points to it.
Sure. Well, and getting your reports in on time should go without saying, but it's what's in those reports, and that gets back to that performance, and we'll get some more about the logic model. Ideally, just a proposal that we can go with or not, I would say. Anything else from you all on performance? I'll open it up to the group and see if people want to share concerns about what they've been asked for before that they thought was useless, or what they think we should be asking that we haven't. Open it up to the group. Any suggestions about how we can improve our performance, request for information, or our evaluation of performance? Monitoring processes. Anything?
Do I have to get up and go to the microphone?
Yes, you do.
I'll keep my comments brief. But I think we need to start a discussion.
I need you to say who you are for the good of the order.
I'm John Homeless from Community Action. And I've been at this a long time, of writing grants and dealing with every year with not knowing whether the city council is going to have level funding, drop the funding. It's not occurred that it's been raised. The funding, in my experience, has not been raised. But I think you have addressed, for me as a program director, as a manager, as a grant writer, have addressed a number of issues that have always been frustrating. One is, it has never been clear to me that the city council knew what its priorities were. And there was a period of time, in my opinion, where the funding was very close to patronage. There were favored organizations that got the funding, and there were organizations that were not allowed in the game. So that the certain organizations were in a way protected. The second thing is, it was never entirely clear to me that the city council knew what the needs were. There's a lot of subjectivity in identifying needs. We periodically get calls from city council saying, in effect, can you help a particular household, a particular family? Very often those calls are based upon the fact that that particular city council person has been approached by a constituent and has turned to somebody to try to see if that situation can be fixed. That's very ad hoc. That very often comes out of an emergency situation and may or may not fit into the needs, and I think that is a practical reality that has to be dealt with. Those needs crop up in a period of time and have to be addressed because there are emergencies, and there are organizations that do that. One thing that I would recommend is that there was a period going back a number of years ago where social service agencies were called together as a coalition quarterly. And out of that coalition, out of those meetings, there developed a need assessment. You heard from the organizations what they were seeing as needs, where the gaps were, where the strengths and various weaknesses. I would recommend that be reinstituted. It would come out of housing and neighborhood development, but it would be a convening of the funded organizations where the agenda would be to discuss what they're seeing, what the problems might be, what areas need to be addressed. And I think that advances, or would advance, the issue of how does the council know what the needs are? Okay, and how does the council know what the priorities? Because I think most of us, whether rightly or wrongly, who are on the front line tend to think we have some ideas about what the needs and what the priorities are and are prepared to share them. There's no forum to do that per se. And there was at one point that forum, and I always felt that it was very valuable. Not only do you build coalitions and collegiality, you also have an opportunity to get some important firsthand information about what we're seeing. But to go back to my original point is really to let you know that, at least from my point of view, that any attempt to address priorities and needs is critical, because I think they are areas that have not been addressed. As a grant writer, there's one line sentence about priority. I mean, that doesn't direct me at all. I can't build a logic model out of neighborhoods should be developed. Right? I can't build anything out of that. I can try, but it's not going to be as specific as what you would want, and what I think benefits the community. So I think there are a number of us who have been at this a long time and have an idea that anything that you can do to identify needs and identify priorities is going to be very helpful. But I think there needs to be a coalition in doing that, because what has always concerned me is the subjectivity aspect of it, that I can have personal preferences, all right, without knowing whether or not that is in fact a fundamental need within the community. So I just thought I'd want to share. When it comes to logic model, there are logic models and there are logic models. And any of us who've dealt with a logic model scurry around and try to find out what do you mean by this. But I think it is a helpful exercise, because it does start from needs. Mm-hmm. If the logic model is done right, then it starts from needs that are shared. In other words, you as a city council and us as providers share a common understanding of what the needs in the community are. You can build a logic model from that. And I think that becomes a critical issue. So I appreciate what you do, and I support it wholeheartedly. I feel very good about it. I think it's going to be very positive results coming from it, because I think you've identified some of the critical areas that need to be addressed. And so I just wanted to share those ideas with you, and at least let, from my point of view, know that I think what you're doing is very, very important and can help clarify some things and benefit the community.
Thank you, John. I've got a question for you. You know, we go back, I've certainly been involved in a lot of those too, and overall, having the coalitions of the providers, in my experience, has been very helpful. The homeless task force, the aging councils,
emergency aid providers.
There has been some concern on the part of some council people that that they wanted to open up opportunities to apply to new entities. And so, as you've brought that up, I just want to throw out whether you see any concern that it would be sort of an old boys club, if you will, by doing that. Again, I found them very helpful and very open, yet how do you do that model and accommodate new guys on the block?
Well, I don't think personally that it necessarily would have to be. I think your core group are those who are already funded, but I don't think it should be closed. I don't think that it should be closed to only those people who are funded, even though that group is going to represent the core group. I think the problem you have as determining funding in that case is the reputation, reliability, and strength of the new agencies that are coming in, because I think there was a period of time going back maybe 10 plus years where there were some applications made by brand new agencies where most of the social service providers questioned or had concerns about the reliability of those organizations to carry through with what they said they were gonna do. And I think that is always gonna be the test. New organizations are springing up all the time and dealing with particular issues. And I think that did occur. That whole issue of, do you let these organizations into the club? In some instances, some of those organizations raised red flags, not all, but some. I mean, we all had to get into the club somehow. And for some of us, it goes back a long time. For others, it has to be more recent. But I don't think that there should be an exclusionary process. I think there are some organizations that would deal with specific needs that would not have been part of the tradition. But, and they should be part of that group. I think that's how you get somehow or other integrated into the system.
And if I can ask you another question, and I failed to bring it up with just the committee, and we can talk about it if people want to, but I went through those years, and I know those years you're talking about when that social service process was opened up. There were inexperienced agencies that had a good idea. There was a desire to open it up, and most of them, if not all of them, washed out. The ones that it cut into core season programming, not that pruning every once in a while doesn't help us all work smarter and better. We know that it's hard, but we know that. Yet they washed out. What thoughts do you, and I'll open this up to others as well, have about whether the city's funding? It tends to be a little easier to get money to start something new, a startup grant to try a new approach for a year, maybe 2 or 3 years. It's harder to get that long-term money that supports what is a proven program long-term. Do you have some thoughts about whether the city's money should be available to new programs?
There could be
new organizations, new programs.
There could be a set-aside. Matter of fact, two of the programs that I represent, the city came to community action and said, would you take on these projects? Mm-hmm. And there was time limited in the case of Project Attention, in the case of Latino Family Development. There was city money there, but it was time limited initially. So that some of the funding that we got came, Kellogg Foundation, for example, sponsored it, but we knew that at the end of that period of 2 years, Kellogg's money was going to go away. The city stepped back and observed and said, okay, this is our idea, you've done this, the city will come in and fund you then as part of the funding system. But I think we would not have had those programs had the city not identified that need and had a set aside to at least start it up. And I think that's a very good idea.
Good
I think
point.
we benefited from it.
And who was the city in that case?
Oh, I think it probably was the mayor and a couple city council members
Okay.
who basically took that initiative. Some of it came out of what now is Rochelle's, but that was part of a conversation. They were based on needs that were identified by people at the governing level as well as people within the social service group. And that was how that came about. It was largely after a period of time of discussions, and the city became but the city was proactive.
Well, and so it didn't go through a formal process, but a more informal process that the city identified and reached out to your agency.
The formalities were done. I mean, yeah, the formalities were done. But the reality that always impressed me was that the city, you know, came to us and said, "This is something we've identified."
Good to point out.
And we have a set aside fund to help you get started. Now, we're going to need some additional funding to go on and assisted with writing the grants. When those grants were over, the city stepped back in and provided core funding to keep the programs going.
Thank you.
I think that's a good system.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Questions? Your review? Oh. John? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Other comments? New programs versus old programs, performance measures.
Couple of recommendations.
Okay, thank you.
Right away.
No, you're fine, John. I'm Barbara Ballantyne. I'm with CASA of Shawnee County. Have been around in and out a long time, and have done a lot of grant consulting, both for funders and for grantees. If you're looking at the logic model and you want to understand the logic model, I would highly suggest that you look at the Kellogg Foundation. They have taken that model and dissected it and tested it so that everybody can operate on the same page with a model that they have been able to demonstrate how it works. So that's my number one recommendation. The other one is, I just really want to reiterate and support everyone's encouragement to really have an inclusive forum for needs assessments, for sharing. It's great that you have all these piles of forms from all these different entities, and to think that somebody can find all the funding they need in any one place is just not possible. So we're in the trenches every day. We're constantly trying to put together our diverse funding, and every dollar counts. So in setting those priorities, we all know how to give as well as take. So it would just be really helpful to create more of that collaborative effort. It also helps the new people because they can find the support, and they can find out really if that need they really want to feel exists, because they may not know about services. So there's a lot of different ways in which that can be helpful to the community as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question for you and it just flew right out. I'll work on it.
If you want that model, I have copies of it. I can send them over or give them to Michelle.
Well, one of the challenges with a logic model, I remember being introduced to it years ago, and we just hated it. It was like, is this another one of those angles that folks take? But once you get inside that there needs to be a reason for everything that you do, it's critically important. Because, and I'd run an agency, worked for an agency, ran an agency for years, and you can do programs that you worked hard at, that good people are doing, maybe that somebody asked for, and you can do a bang-up job. I think of our newsletter, a newsletter that we did years ago. We did a great job, but we would joke about it being a birdcage liner, and in time we realized that we could do way better getting an article in the Topeka public media once a month for far less money and staff time and reach 100,000 people instead of 200 by changing. And we could meet our program outputs. We said we'd print 4 a year or whatever it was, and we'd get it out to so many people, and we did, but we weren't really accomplishing much for mission, and it was costly. It's hard to get a newsletter out, just as an example. And so learning that we needed to take every single activity that we did and make sure it really was accomplishing something for that overall outcome that we were working on for whichever target group it was really important. And it is, you lose sight of that sometimes, you do. But you can still be producing your outputs and getting your reports in, so. I'm curious, let me ask you though, there is when John was talking, he mentioned some different groups. Is it, from time to time, the city and county and other groups have sort of coordinated to, this is the question I had, have coordinated to say, we don't want to burden the agencies by the agencies having to do all these applications. Let's kind of split it up, like the discussion about maybe the county just doing aging at one point, the county even, and we've, in the process of this, found the documentation, had the voters vote on an aging mill levy. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever, it was, the language in it was that it would cap that mill levy at no more than 1 mill, which meant, I guess, that anything under that was okay, because it has substantially dropped. But the idea was all the aging money would be handled in one place so that it would be the best bang for the buck in terms of people looking at performance and needs and performance, and that it would be administered just in one place, so it was really efficient, instead of that, so that the community and the donors got the best bang, and the aging agency heads didn't have to do 8 different funding applications. They could do 1 or 2. That, of course, though, if you do that, cuts the agencies out of multiple options to go get somebody else to fund something that their primary source won't fund. Do you have any comments about that, you or any of you? The idea of us, for instance, looking at these priorities and then saying, let's divvy it up and have the county do this and we'll do that, that sort of thing. Jocelyn? Barb can answer.
Council, delegates also, just make a comment.
Oh, okay. Do you want to make a comment first?
I did.
Okay.
And the first comment that I'll say is, I think that we have to be very cautious in mentioning mill levy increases for funding of social services when we are, I think, one of the few cities in the whole nation that actually does fund social services, number one. And number two, especially after we went through an excruciating budget in which we had to go ahead and do a mill levy increase that none of us wanted to do, but that we needed to do. And as we're looking to optimize the city services. I think it's a beautiful idea if that would not, but I just don't think that us going ahead and doing a mill levy increase to fund social services is something that.
I'm sorry, I was not suggesting that.
Okay.
But
Just-
what years ago, it was like in 1980, that people had been having the same sort of conversation. What are we gonna do? How do we prioritize, and how can we be the most efficient and the most effective at targeting those dollars? And services for the aging were a priority at that time, to the point where it went to a ballot question countywide about a mill levy just for aging services, and the voters voted 60% or more. We did a little research since the last meeting to approve it. It just turns out that the language was that it was to not be more than a mill, not that there was no minimum of how much was going to be provided. So those numbers have dropped over the years. But the voters, at that point, the voters were even engaged in providing funding for that service. So I was wandering a little bit perhaps, but that's what I was trying to share. It's interesting as the different funding units have tried to work on doing a great job, how they've sorted it and how they've tried to approach it. Did you have?
Just a few comments. Jocelyn Lyons, Jayhawk Area Agency on Aging. I agree with you, Councilwoman Heller, in that there was some history in which there was a review in which they wanted to look at the various funding sources to fund certain programs, particularly in aging is what I'm speaking on. In that there were multiple funding agencies, and the thought was to allow the county to maybe fund a certain number of those agencies entirely, and the city, Jayhawk Area Agency on Aging, United Way, et cetera. The communication, that was not agreeable because there were funding agencies that maybe did not want to give up their provider that they was providing funds to. So I don't know if you recall any of that or not.
do.
And then the other thing that I like to comment on is, and just to go back to that a little bit, I can see that it would be more, that it could be provider friendly because of reporting requirements. They would not necessarily have to provide multiple reports.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The other thing that I wanted to comment on was that there was a suggestion of the funding agencies perhaps meeting in order to collaborate. And that was done several years ago. That was probably, I know that was back in the 80s. It had to be back in the 80s, in which the funding agencies met on a quarterly basis. That provided them an opportunity to communicate what their priorities may be. So each source, may it be the city, the county, United Way, Jayhawk Area Agency on Aging, or whoever else provided funds, that they would be able to know where those priorities laid at. They would be able to fill in the gaps if needed, but we would all know what our priorities were. It's also at this time, since the 80s, or the latter 70s, the 80s, in order for you to also know what those priorities may be, or those mandates that may be passed down, such as in our case, where we allocate over $1 million to providers, but there is a priority that is being passed down by the federal level, in which states where those dollars should go to. Not provider, but the type of
Right, and
services.
CDBG has that too.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So by knowing that, or by us all collaborating, we would be able to have that information. And I think at that point would be able to fund agencies or have those services that would be more efficient in our city.
So in terms of the aging, that example, and you're right, what happened was, even though that idea was to have the county do all of them, there were
The county or the
elected
city.
officials or
Right.
whoever that didn't
Right.
want to let go of
That's
having
correct.
a piece of funding.
That's correct. That was something that was suggested by the Intergovernmental Committee director at that time. But yes, it was a case in which some of those organizations did not want to lose their provider. So it kind of failed.
And I was, too many moving parts for me in all this. In terms of that group that met quarterly, that John talked about earlier, some people end up, if they're being funded by multiple sources, also then sitting on like 6 of these agency director groups. Is that better than finding yourself just on one? I mean, is it okay?
We're talking about 2 different groups. So yes, it is very good for the provider agencies to come together in order to identify what those needs are.
Mm-hmm.
It's also good for the funding agencies to come together to look at our dollars, where we may be seeing a decrease at, but also looking at our priorities, examining our priorities together. Because, I know that the city of Topeka has absolutely no idea what the priorities may be for JAAA that has been set forth by the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's some I know. But, I mean, as a whole, you may not know that information. So I think it would be important. I think it's a great suggestion in order for the funding agencies to come together to have a discussion. And that would help each one of us.
When you were talking about those quarterly meetings, then those weren't in any particular sector or the agencies that were funded by a certain
No, it
source,
was-
but those were more a community-wide?
That was a community-wide.
Okay.
And then they would discuss certain sectors.
Okay.
Mhm.
My concern with this process is that we're already starting to see, and this is no pun on any of the organizations, my organization, because the automatic response, it's gonna be my organization. And it's automatic, and it's not, again, each of you are doing a huge service to the sector that you're serving. But at this point in time, it's not about any organization. It should be about what the city priorities are, and then look for the organizations that are meeting those priorities. And I think that John actually spoke to that when he was talking about, when you define your priorities, then then you're doing a service to the organizations, because what you're doing is that you're letting us know, here it is. Because what you're describing is extremely adequate. Nobody understands what federal requirements you have, but at the same time, nobody understands the federal mandates that all the other organizations have to fulfill as well. And it's not so much about what mandates each individual organization has. The real big question that I think that we are trying to tackle here is, what is the big need that for the next 5 years the city has, that we have to or should be investing in? Because of course, this is a process that we're gonna probably have to repeat in 5 years because priorities change. But if we're gonna be a city with a vision, I think that we have to sit down and establish what our priorities are as a city based on what the needs are out in the community. The community does have to talk about what the needs are out there. And then we're gonna have to find out, with help of the organizations, with help of the funders and of the community, what are the needs? And I think that we're all speaking the same language. What are the needs that we see in the community as the highest priorities that we need to tackle for the next 5 years? And then go ahead and establish, okay, these are the priorities, then based on what, like you're saying, Karen, everybody else is funding, what we are seeing a gap in, here is exactly where we want to allocate our funds, here is our priority, who are the organizations fulfilling this service so that we can go ahead and be supportive of them, and then work on measuring them. Madam Chair.
Yes. There you go. Nancy.
I'm Nancy Johnson, CRC, Community Resources Council. And let me just make a couple of comments. One, you're overlooking one of the most important instruments that we have in this town to look at the needs and the gaps, and that's MacLink. And I would advise you to request from CRC monthly a list of what services are being provided, because this gives you an actual number of how many baskets are being delivered, utilities are being paid, rent's being paid, things like that from the various agencies. And there are how many, GR, 13, 20, 18 agencies now on this system. So that there is little duplication. But if you really want to see the basic needs of this community, I would request from CRC that you get a report of that every single month. Number two is, and I'm going to go back to Jocelyn, is that many times funders all of a sudden come up with a new priority, and that came out of senior transportation, was that JAAA came to us and said, you're working with the city and the county. Please know JAAA has told the senior community centers here in town that if they do not propose or get a pilot consolidation dispatching system going by the year 2014, they will not be funded for transportation. Well, now that's a very different way to look at what is important, at which point we pulled together a senior transportation committee, which not only included the mayor, but a county commission. It included county, it included all the senior centers, it included the Topeka Transit, any Meals on Wheels were there, anybody that was affected by seniors. And we have been meeting for the last 5 years. And now we have the senior centers that have come together. They have met with JAAA and with Topeka Transit, and they have a system now that they're going to pilot for the next 6 months on central dispatching. Will it work? We don't know, but at least a pilot program is going to be offered. The third thing is that CRC, under the direction of Marcia Pope with Community Foundation, does host a quarterly funders meeting, usually at 7:30 in the morning at Community Foundation. But on Thursday, we're hosting one at lunch time. Councilman Hiller, if you would like to join us, we would be delighted to have you. But this does not include state, federal, JAAA. This is more your private funders, Community Foundation, CAP-Fed, Security Benefit, United Way, these. And we also look at who's running capital campaigns, because we know that there's only so many people that can give to so many organizations.
So that you have to not only look at who your funders are, you also have to look at all the capital campaigns that are going on in the community too. So this is a much more complicated formula than just looking at the city and the county and Jayhawk and those principal funders we think of, because there are a lot of grants that are going on out there too, the 2040 Club and things like that. So we try to pull them around quarterly and talk about, okay, what are you looking for as your priorities? So you are more than welcome to join us. But I request that you request a monthly report from MacLink. And I'm sure the new interim director of CRC, G.R. Laughlin, would be glad to provide that for you.
Oh, congratulations, GR. Well, I appreciate you bringing up the points that you did in that. One of the things that's concerned me about performance, priorities, however you want to look at it, is that, for instance, if you read the applications from the senior services agencies to the city council, they really didn't mention that transportation initiative at all, none of them. And so when I mentioned staffing earlier, and you've done a good job, everyone here has done a good job of talking about all the moving parts, it's very difficult for the individual city council members to simply be aware of all that stuff. Technically, CRC is funded in part to do that for the council. The council has not asked for that information and feedback. You've had to kind of chase the council recently, if you will, on that, and any of this is not judgmental, it's just where we moved. And so for us to be able to have somebody that we can rely on as a council, whether they're on the city staff or whether it's a contracted agency that can do that briefing for us and help us shape those priorities, in my view, is important, just because of all of the detail that people have mentioned. I can personally go to that meeting, but I can't go to all of them, and the council members can't be relied on, whether it's me or anybody else, to do that visioning and that communication for the city council, in my opinion.
We would be also glad to show you trends of the last 5 years with MacLink, wouldn't you, GR? But it does do food, housing, and clothing, and things like that. A number, really, how many categories are on that?
Well, that's the emergency aid, but that's not all the other kinds of programs that are there in the community. Michelle?
And that's exactly what I was gonna say. I think that the MacLink idea is a wonderful idea, but it leaves out several organizations. I'm looking at Ms. McKee over here.
Right.
I am looking at, Health Access. I am looking at Safe Streets. I am looking at different organizations that are not included in these services.
They are only, when you're looking at emergency, and many cities are, or cities and counties are looking at just emergency services, this gives you the picture of exactly what is happening in Topeka, Kansas.
And again, it has to go back
Absolutely.
to our priorities.
Right.
We have not defined emergency services as our priority to fund.
Got another comment, then we're gonna wrap up.
First of all, I want to thank you for having these meetings and allowing us to come and observe. Going back to what Councilwoman Hiller said early on in the meeting, is that at the very first meeting that you had, you did absolutely identify the agencies that were being funded and went over them individually, one by one, and felt that all of them were important. And I think that in itself simplifies your job in that you have a list of priorities. I think the only thing that you really need to do is look, did we miss something? And I think that, I want to try to simplify your job. I think you have identified what some of those priorities are and just kind of looking for the gaps. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And you combine that with what Councilwoman De La Isla said, if we've got a great council. We've got people who care a lot. We won't fund everything. That's easy. But identifying those needs and delivering them to the council in a way that we can sort things out, what everybody else is funding, so that we can figure that balance out, and then where the gaps are, if any. That will help us then decide whether we're just going to continue funding the kinds of things we did the year before, or whether there are some changes that we want to affirmatively make. Really appreciate all of the input from everyone on the committee as well as the audience today. Our subject matter, we've got some staff development that'll come to us between this meeting and next. We reconvene, Jenny, can you help me, January the 17th? And our subject matter next time will be the application process itself. Did you say January 13th?
I was gonna say, yeah.
January 13th here from 3 to 5, the application process itself. Thank you all for coming. Council members, or committee members, we've got some updates and some samples of various other things that you can pick up on your way out.
I'm sorry I left you with that.
Michigan versus K-State, Arizona. It's like it all comes together. Your boss is making a lot of media play lately.
So are these,
That's awesome.
This is the grant protocols for the alcohol and drug and the senior stuff. It's a grant protocol for United Way.
Yeah, I'll do it.
This is what's happened with
I just don't want to
amazing
become a
transportation
full-time
grants.
kid, but,
pilot program?
so I don't think I.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind
This
doing
is the
that at some
backup
point.
on the
I just gotta do it
alcohol and
myself.
drug money if you're
Yeah, I'll
interested
do
in
it.
looking at it.
Tell me what to do, when to do it, and who to write a check.
I don't know what this is.
That's Macklin.
All done.
Can I have the United
Never
Way
have to see
document?
those people
Absolutely.
again.
Did you get the alcohol and drug?
No, it's funny, this, I assume this group's like others, but they still keep texting each other.